Well, the past week was a diplomatic marathon for South Africa as the Department of International Relations hosted Russia, the US and the European Union one after the other. And just to look at what the significance of all this interaction was, we're joined now via Zoom by Wits Business School Professor Christopher Malikane. A very good morning to you, Prof, and thanks for making the time.
Good morning, Treasury, and good morning to the viewers.
In 1 week, Russia, the US and the European Union made visits to the country. What's the significance of the timing and the content of these visits?
Well, it's highly significant because these things are occurring in the context where there are tensions between the West and Russia, and there's a war going on between Russia and NATO, which appears as a war between Russia and the Ukraine. But also it is taking place in the context where Brazil has just had an election where the Brazilians elected a left-leaning president. But also the third factor is that China is still playing a very significant role as a rising superpower on the globe. So all these three factors, they coalesce to cause the EU and the US to be on a diplomatic mission.
So Janet Yellen, while displaying frustration with the slow pace of the implementation of the just energy transition, also said that despite the energy crisis in South Africa, which has her focus, and corruption, there were many other opportunities in South Africa. Why is there this urgency, especially from the US, for South Africa to implement the just energy transition?
Well, from the standpoint of the three factors that I've spoken about, particularly the war between NATO and Russia, the strategy is that the NATO countries that are heavily reliant on Russia for energy, they are very much desperate for alternative sources of energy. We've seen in the EU some countries reopening their coal-fired power stations and coal mines. So this drive is basically to ensure that South Africa sustains and increases its supply for coal to NATO countries as a bulwark against the resistance that is coming in response to Russia. So South Africa's role really in this instance is to be a buffer to assist NATO countries in their fight against Russia. And that is the strategic role that South Africa is currently playing with the massive exports of coal, while at the same time we are made to shut down our coal-fired power stations. Yet the US and the EU are spearheading climate change. So when it suits them, they reopen coal-fired power stations. But when it suits us, we are not supposed to be using our coal-fired power stations to industrialize and so forth.
I found this one interesting, a lot of comparison on the weight of either Russia or the US in terms of their importance to South Africa. A Weekend Opinion piece says that a Weekend Opinion piece written by Lindiwe Mazibuko says Russia's trade with South Africa constituted about, in 22, constituted about 13 billion with a 3.1 trade deficit compared to the US's, look at that huge difference, 282 billion with a 40.7 trade surplus, making Russia's pretensions, she argues, making Russia's pretensions to being an important partner questionable. Is this how you also see this picture?
No, we need to look at the evolution of these statistics historically. You know, South Africa, we all know, is a domain of the British. It is a history of British colonialism, and the influence of Britain in South Africa is still huge. And Britain, the EU and the US, they form one axis in the global political economy. What the former professor of Uganda called multilateral imperialism. So these are the countries that have never really supported our struggle for national liberation in South Africa. And yet, when we got that freedom, we could not break out of the control of the historical forces that held South Africa for a long time. And the US has been leading in that. I mean, we know Oliver Tambo once said that they went to the US to seek for assistance in the fight against apartheid, and the US state rejected the ANC, and Russia accepted the ANC. Yet, the dominance of the US in the South African economy still remains because we have not managed to break out completely of the colonialism that we suffered. That is why Russia is so small. Had we broken out, those statistics would have changed over the past 8 years.
So, Prof, based on what you're saying, what is the significance of the difference in the numbers?
The significance is that if South Africa were to take a pro-Russian position, which is historically correct from the standpoint of where we come from as a country, because Russia supported us, the majority, particularly of black people, in the fight against apartheid. So we've got that historical connection and the need to build those relationships with Russia. But we are still trapped. If we move, we need to as South Africans, accept, the majority of South Africans accept that there will be some ructions in our economy as we restructure our global international relations.
Prof,
but if we are not courage, to break out, then we will remain. We'll remain trapped,
Prof, I'm being rushed for time, but I want to ask you quickly. Of course, we're talking about the national interest, but there's also the continental interest. Yellen also went to Senegal and Zambia. Just quickly, the intentions of these countries for the continent.
Is to consolidate the influence of NATO countries on the African continent. In Zambia, we know that the US has opened AFRICOM, and in Senegal, the US needs to have an anchor in West Africa where it can have an influence. We know that already there was a coup in Burkina Faso where the people of Burkina Faso were welcoming Russia, right, as a friend. So that on its own questions the US's hegemony in West Africa. And as we speak now, the NATO head is in Asia, rebuilding those links with South Korea and Japan, which, in my view, is a means of encircling China and Russia and North Korea in a way. So there are rising tensions taking place.
Always a pleasure talking to you. Professor Chris Malikane is with the Wits Business School and just giving us his post-analysis of that diplomatic activity, flurry of activity that happened last week.